to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, our topic is the pawns, and especially pawns in the endgames. Let's get started with our first example. Here we go. In this endgame with only the kings and the pawns on the board, each side has 6 pawns. However, there is a major difference in the pawn structure between the two sides. First, let's talk about strategy. The pawns that white has on b3 and b2 are considered doubled pawns. Generally, that's considered inferior compared to having pawns on separate files, like here, for example, in the center, connected on d4 and e4, as well as f3. Those 3 pawns are all on separate files, and they are a nice chain of pawns. In addition to the fact that the pawns on b2 and b3 are doubled, they are also so-called isolated, meaning that there is no pawn on either side of them. So that's the worst type of pawns in general. Now white has also another isolated pawn on h5. However, that is only one part of the picture. We'll come back to this in just a moment. Let's look at the black pawn structure for a moment. Black has 3 nicely connected pawns on the queen side. That's all good and fine. However, black also has a pair of doubled pawns on the king side. Now, let's come back to the important point actually about this endgame. Because while in the opening or in the middle game, what we talked about so far is absolutely important, in this case there is something that is a lot more important than what we talked about so far. Namely the fact that the white pawn on h5 is far advanced and it's a so-called passed pawn. We define a pawn being a passed pawn when there is no enemy pawn in front of it, and that is certainly the case here. Now, another very important thing about this situation is the positioning of the 2 kings, and especially of black's king. This very same pawn on h5, if the black king would be somewhere right on the king's side, let's say on g7 or g8 even, kind of close to white's h5 pawn, then not only that king would hold off white's pawn from advancing and potentially becoming a queen, but in fact could walk up to the square on h6 and in fact attack the white pawn on h5, and as that pawn has no neighboring pawn, that pawn would be easily captured by black's king. However, we are talking about what if, and as we know, that doesn't help usually. So reality is in this case that even if the black king would start running as soon as it can and go to b8, we can tell already visually that that king is just far too far from the king's side, and therefore when white will advance the pawn and the black king gets closer and the white pawn advances further, there is nothing that black can do to prevent white's pawn from becoming a queen. Let's go back for a moment to the very beginning. What I'd like to stress that in a situation like this, when you would have a passed pawn, a pawn that does not have an enemy pawn in front of it, neither does black in this case have another piece, not a bishop or a knight or any other piece, that could come and control any of the squares that's in the path of white's pawn. In these situations, it is your absolute priority to start pushing that pawn, because if white would wait too long, the black king indeed could come and then catch the pawn, meaning that when the pawn would be ready to get promoted, the black king could capture it. So therefore, in this case, the absolute priority is push the pawn as quickly as you can before the opponent would get the chance to stop it. And now let's move on to a more complex situation. Here we go. In this endgame, it's not only pawns on the board, but black has actually an extra rook. We look at this position first with white being on move. If you purely look at the numbers, on the number scale, white only has 2 pawns, being worth 2 points, versus black having an extra rook, which is worth 5 points. However, when passed pawns are far advanced, and especially when they are connected, they all of a sudden gain tremendous value, because the potential of becoming a queen and a 9-point piece becomes realistic. In this particular case, white has actually 2 different ways to win. It doesn't even particularly matter which pawn white would push first. White could choose to push the f-pawn first, and then white would achieve the famous situation when white would have 2 pawns on the 6th rank. Assuming that the kings are not part of this fight because they are too far away from that side of the board, generally, when there are 2 connected passed pawns reaching the 6th rank, from white's perspective of course, and the opponent has a rook and no other pieces to aid to stop the promotion of the enemy pawns, the 2 pawns are stronger than a rook. So this is one of those exceptions when the straight material count is not the accurate evaluation of the situation. For example, let's see what happens if black would attack the pawns on the 6th rank. White could simply advance further the pawn. If now the black rook captures the white pawn on g6, then the white f-pawn would simply get promoted. Or if black would play rook f6, trying to hold off the f-pawn, then white would advance the g-pawn, and again black would be helpless in stopping at least one of the pawn's promotion. You may wonder what happens if now black would all of a sudden start giving checks. Well, this could certainly delay the end, however, not actually change the outcome. For example, white would simply get closer with his own king to the rook, and it could go to d4 now, or it could go just as well to d2. It doesn't particularly matter. What matters is that white with the king is coming closer and closer to that rook that's giving the checks, until at the end the rook runs out of checks. And here is the last check, and the king reached a file right next to the rook, and now of course an additional check would cost black the rook. And otherwise, for example, when rook captures pawn, finally one of the white pawns get promoted, and white has reached a theoretically won endgame where white has a queen, a much stronger piece than a rook. Let's go back all the way to the beginning, and also I'd like to mention that white could also push the g-pawn first. In that case also white has a winning position. Black's problem is that the king is too far from the other side of the board, and it will arrive too late aiding the rook. If black could now make one more move by coming to e6, black would be winning easily. However, in this case, it was white's turn, and white is the one ready to push the pawn, and then one of the 2 white pawns will certainly get promoted. And again, the same story. If black starts giving checks, the king will run away and black will run out of checks. In this case, white would have 2 methods to achieve that. The simplest is to simply hide behind black's king, that is, move the king onto the same file. with black's king, and therefore the black rook ran out of checks. Of course, the other option was to try to move upward close to the rook and go to, let's say, b4 and then a5 from the checks and get up to the 7th rank, and in that case also the black rook would run out of checks. However, clearly the simplest option is just to go to the d file, and then already the checks are over and the white pawn will get promoted next. And now let's see the same position with black to move. What a world of a difference! Now all of a sudden black has a winning position. Black has several ways to achieve the win, but here is the simplest one. The rook moving, checking white's king. King b2, of course, white naturally wants to get closer to the pawns in order to aid them, helping them, to protect them, and to try to get them promoted. And here comes a very important pattern that I'd like you to remember. That when these white pawns, connected passed pawns, are trying to get promoted, a very effective way to hold them off is to put the rook behind the further advanced pawn. So right now what happens is the g pawn cannot move forward without the black rook capturing it right away, and on the other hand, if the other pawn tries to advance, then the f pawn no longer protects the pawn on g6, and therefore the rook will capture on g6, attacking the f6 pawn. When that one advances, fortunately for black, the rook can go just behind it and then capture the f pawn as well on the following move. So now we know that black should give a check and then move the rook behind the g pawn, which is the further advanced one. Now you may wonder what will happen if white doesn't push either pawn right now but plays king c3 and tries to get the king closer to the pawns so the rook will not be able to capture them. The problem is that the black king is also active and can come to the aid and simply play king c6 and king d4, then king d6. And now the black king is holding off white's king, doesn't let it cross and get towards f6 to help to advance further the pawns. And now the win is rather simple. For example, king e4, black can get even closer to the pawns. If king e5, easiest way is to check. King f4, and now we can see how the black king nicely moved right in between the two white pawns, and the next thing is to attack the base of the pawn chain on f5 with the rook, capture it, and then the g6 pawn will fall as well. For example, king g4. Now there are many ways to win. For example, rook f1, and then the rook will capture the pawn, and black's win is rather simple. Let's move on to another type of endgame now, where white only has one pawn. However, that pawn is even more advanced, but the white king is also very close to it to help it. In this case, white is about to promote the pawn already. So black, because of that, cannot win, and in fact have to play good moves to not lose. There are two moves that can achieve that. One, which is the simplest and the most natural move, to just step behind white's far advanced pawn by moving the rook to e1. Of course, now if the pawn advances, the black rook will capture it. Therefore, white will rather move to f7 with the king, protecting the e7 pawn. And now white is about to promote the pawn further to e8, and then if rook captures, king captures. That means that only the two kings will be left on the board, which is an automatic draw. Ends the game. So right now black can right away capture the pawn with the rook if they choose to, or they can play, for example, king c7, when white already has to advance the pawn, rook captures, king captures, and draw. If white wouldn't rush advancing the pawn but would make, for example, a move like king f8, that would be a big mistake, as then all of a sudden black would win right away after playing king d7 and then capturing the pawn on e7 for free. The only other move in the starting position that does not lose for black is to move the rook from d1 to g1, giving a check to the king, and then either move back to e1 now and still achieve a simple draw, or give another check. And keep giving checks until you can. And also, for example, if the white king tries to go far away enough from the pawn on e7, then all of a sudden black can play for a win and play rook e1. So certainly giving the check first on move 1 is the trickier way to go, giving white an opportunity to go wrong. But if white doesn't overpush, if white just decides to repeat moves when the checks arrive, the game, of course, is still a simple draw. And now we're changing the topics altogether to endgames where one side has a queen and the other side has a far advanced passed pawn all the way on the 7th rank, just one rank away from getting promoted. However, that's a big step to make. Right now in the situation, it is black's turn. And despite the fact that it is black's turn, this position is a theoretical draw, which means that even with the best play, there is no way for black to make progress and to win this game. I'd like you to remember this endgame because it's rather important to know whether or not what is the objective evaluation of such an endgame. And what's important to remember about this situation is that white has a so-called bishop pawn, or in other words, a pawn on the C or F files are called bishop pawns, because they are the file on which the bishops start the game. And because of a specific situation that involves stalemate, the stronger side, in this case black, cannot make progress. The reason being that even if black succeeds in capturing the pawn, even in the case that black succeeds to capture the pawn on c7, the game would be still stalemate. The white king being in the corner, white has no other pieces, and therefore the game is a draw, a tie. And that would certainly please white in this situation, given the fact that black is a whole queen up. Alternatively, if black does not capture the pawn, but let's say starts giving some checks, the white king will simply keep moving back to the corner with the hopes that even if the black queen gets to capture the pawn, the game still will end with stalemate. And therefore, black did not make any progress. So remember, a position like this, when the black king is so far away so it cannot really get involved in the action, the game still is a draw. Let's move on to the next example, when on the other hand, that pawn is not on the bishop file. What a major difference you shall see. Again, it is black's turn to start to move. And here, unlike in the last example, black can make progress despite that again their king is far away from action. Here is what the game plan has to be. Black needs to force the white king under its own pawn, so therefore it will prevent the d7 pawn of advancing. Once the white king has been forced to the d8 square, that's the time when the black king can safely come closer to aid the black queen to then later win the pawn on d7. Obviously, the black king could not start coming closer to white's pawn right now, right away, with king g2, because then the white pawn would simply get promoted. Now black has to make a whole bunch of well-placed checks in order to achieve that goal, because naturally white will have the opposite goal, making sure not stepping in front of his own pawn. What you shall see is the reason is why black will succeed in doing just that is that otherwise white will lose the pawn altogether. And of course that's not a good choice unless there would be a stalemate in the picture. But you shall see it is not the case here. Now any of the checks that black can give would still maintain a significant advantage, so it doesn't matter that much which check you start with. However, ultimately the queen needs to get close to where the white king and pawn are. The best move is to play queen a5 right now, because if here the white king moves anywhere else but to c8, for example to b7, the black queen would immediately go to d8, blockading the promotion square of the white pawn, and then immediately after that, for example, after king c6, which protects the pawn, the black king would be free to just simply move somewhere up to e6 and then attack the pawn on d7 and capture it. So the only serious attempt for white for fight is to go with the king to c8. Now the king is supporting the potential promotion of the white pawn. And now here comes the technique that you should try to remember. Queen c5 check. If the king moves to d8, then immediately the black king is ready to come to the help. But what happens if the king decides not to do that favor and moves the other way? Well, in that case the queen will move to d6, attacking the pawn on d7 and of course preventing the pawn of getting promoted without being captured. And now the white king moves to c8, protecting the pawn and threatening to promote it. Then comes the key idea to give the check with the queen on c6. And now we'll see the major difference, that unlike when the pawn was on the c-file and the king moved left of the pawn, the queen couldn't safely capture it because it would have resulted a stalemate. Here that's certainly not the case, because after queen captures pawn, now the white king is not stalemated, it can easily move, and then all black will need to do is to march up on this diagonal one step at a time, move to c6, followed by checkmating the white king. Now on the other hand, what happens if after queen a5 check, king c8, queen c5 check, king b7, queen d6, king c8, queen c6, the king goes the other way to d8. Well, as we said, that is the time to bring the king. And now, after king e7, the same method starts all over again. Black can either give a check or create a pin. Again, king e8, check, king f7, we go behind the pawn, king protects, and again the same idea from the other side. Queen e6, check, king needs to go to d8 to keep hanging on to the pawn, and the moment when the king is in front of the pawn, the other side can bring the king, and that is exactly the goal. King c7, again we pin the pawn, king c8, we do it again from the other side, queen d6, behind the pawn, king protects, check. And the king needs to go under, and again the king is getting closer and closer. King e4, king e7, we do the pin again, king e8, the check, and going behind, and the check. King is under its own pawn, and the king is real close now. And now we can simply give check right away because the black king is helping. King d8, still hanging onto the pawn, and now we can see how the king is aiding the queen, and on the next move black is ready to capture the pawn, followed by checkmate. Well, I hope you remember these important endgame techniques on how to fight against a far advanced pawn if you have a rook or a queen. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week. Bye bye.